Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I might say, I made a broadcast just a few days ago talking about multiculturalism, and it occurred to me now to make another following up on some of the unresolved points, questions, and contentions. Now, I love the live stream format. I love the spontaneity it brings to what would otherwise be incredibly dry and difficult topics of contention, such as this one. It's an imperfect medium, and there are stakes. I would say that I am open to the possibility that this particular live stream will end up being shared only to Patreon subscribers or only to people who are interested in hearing it. Now, in saying that, you may imagine that have had an avalanche of criticisms or questions or even hate mail in response to my earlier video. That's not the case at all. It's interesting what my audience is shocked by, what my audience chooses to take the time and spend the effort to disagree with me about, and what they do not. So I've had innumerable emails sent to me in the past about video games and quitting video games. I've had innumerable emails sent to me about the ethics of pet ownership and of how to treat wild animals and what to do about rat infestations. So there are sometimes quite particular ethical problems of this kind, sometimes involving people's direct lives. I do get a lot of email. I've also had a lot of email and frankly hate mail about some completely abstract philosophical questions that couldn't possibly change anyone's life, but where people's own ego, people's own sense of intellectual superiority over others is attached to those abstract ideas. Now, perhaps I'm speculating wildly here. Perhaps people in the audience will write in and let me know how wrong I am. But I would say that this particular issue really just astonishes people. It really is just that people, in response to my position on multiculturalism, don't know what to say, don't know what question to ask, don't know what objection to offer, and they find themselves questioning very, very fundamental presuppositions of their own political perspective. Now, sometimes our prejudices are revealed through the word associations in our language. If I say to you cultural, what's the next word in the sentence? Cultural heritage, cultural tradition, cultural preservation, right? When we use words like culture and cultural, there's a very deep-seated assumption that our role and responsibility is to unquestioningly promote, promulgate, perpetuate, preserve this culture. That our relationship to culture is one of preservation. We don't even have linguistically the concept of cultural destruction, cultural renovation, cultural recycling, right? That culture might be something you have to demolish in order to replace it with something better, Now, my way of talking about these subjects is normally to first and foremost put a human face on the issue, to give you a sense of what the cost and consequences of our, political beliefs would be on a one-to-one human scale. And then I think it's quite easy, once you've established that understanding with your audience, to then scale up and talk about issues on the level of millions of people. The implications over millions of years. It may sound ridiculous, but we're not just dealing with decades or centuries here. We're dealing with millions of people and millions of years. That's the scale on which culture, exists and influences human life. That's the scale on which it makes some things thinkable and some things unthinkable. Right now, in a country like Canada, there are some people for whom it is completely unthinkable to be married and pregnant at the age of 16. And there are some people for whom anything other than being married and pregnant at the age of 16 is unthinkable, right? And then what that entails in terms of career and education and everything else for the life of that woman and for the life of the children she's raising, right, is tremendously profound. How can we have two populations living within one and the same country and participating in the same democracy? One culture based on, let's specify a little further. Let's say there's a culture that's based on arranged marriage, that parents arrange when the child is 14, 15 years old. They arrange for them to be married at 16, and then at 16 the marriage happens, which, by the way, all over the world, I think 16 is pretty much the legal age of marriage. It's kind of amazing what a vestige that is of an earlier time. If you look into it where you're living, it may be that with the parents' permission, people can get married as young as 14 and so on. It's these kind of medieval assumptions about marriage, still exist. Now, just to put this in contrast, can you get a tattoo at the age of 14? Can you get a tattoo at the age of 15 or 16? Most jurisdictions around the world, the answer is no. You have to wait until you're 18 or some other age of majority to get a tattoo. Why? Because getting a tattoo is a decision that will affect you for the rest of your life. The question of which university you're going to go to and what subject you're going to study and whether or not you join the army, these are also decisions that affect the rest of your life. The decision to get married or to get pregnant and have children, this is also a decision that affects the rest of your life. But, conveniently, we pretend that these are quite different from getting a tattoo. We preserve this kind of the private scope for the individual to make these decisions recklessly on their own behalf, or indeed for their parents to make these decisions recklessly on their behalf. We don't want to question the extent to which this might be much more important, much more fateful a decision than getting a tattoo, much more fateful even than getting a tattoo on your face at the age of 16. It's the decision to get married and have children at that age, and all the doors that closes for you, and then just the one door it leaves open for yourself. And then the extent to which a young woman who makes that decision is very likely to justify her decision by inculcating the same cultural values into her children, by insisting on the necessity and moral superiority of this one path alone. Now, just to be fair, going to medical school is miserable. Becoming a medical doctor is miserable. Going to law school is miserable. Becoming a lawyer is miserable. And all my life, I have seen how parents who made those sacrifices and those commitments likewise try to inculcate into their children the superiority of the path of going to medical school with the path of going to law school. I admit this is something that it's a critique or an analysis, is not only the religious fundamentalists among us who are susceptible to this. On that human scale of one person that you're meeting, getting to know face to face, isn't it a terrible thing to dismiss this one person you may know and say, well, it's fine for you to be a member of this church, to be a member of this religion. It's fine for you to devote yourself to these abstractions, to these prayers, to this chanting, let's say. It's a very common thing. It's fine for you to believe in these fictional, fabulous things. It's fine for you to drop out of school, get married, and raise children at age 16, and to never know anything else, to never have any other potential in your life, to never even have a period of questioning and trying your limits and finding out what you could do or might do. And it's fine for you. Why? Because of your culture. This leads to a view that is very similar to racism, but it could be called culturism, right? Yeah. So again, growing up in downtown Toronto, I knew Orthodox Jews. I'm ethnically Jewish myself, by the way, in case you hadn't guessed. I'm not a member of the religion. I'm not a religious Jew. I'm a nihilistic atheist Jew. I knew Orthodox Jews who were making these kinds of decisions. On what basis? Oh, because that's their culture. That's their tradition, because they're beholden to preserving and perpetuating that tradition. And they didn't feel that others were beholden to that tradition. No, Judaism's unusually clear-cut that way. Judaism is a religion with a very, very small role for converting outsiders. Most other religions instead are more interested in proving to the whole world that their particular set of beliefs are true and valid for all mankind or for all the world. But within Judaism, for the most part, people are quite content to just feel that their tradition is superior for them, that they personally should live by these ethical rules, and whether or not anyone else does is immaterial because they're outside of that tradition. Now, I could tell quite a few stories of this kind. I remember a young woman. So this is before I got married. This is before I met Melissa. This wasn't me cheating on anyone. I remember a young woman who met me at a party, and the first hint that she was Orthodox Jewish fanatic in this sense was her style of dress and her hair. And the cues aren't that obvious, by the way, I just mentioned, with women's dress anyway in Judaism. And I remember how she was talking, I remember how she was making eye contact with me. And her whole manner of kind of flirting with me or coming on to me had shifted, because at first she was suspecting that I was Jewish just based on my face. And then when she knew for a fact, she was even more forward. This young woman. So we were both in university. I don't know. We were both 20, we were both 21 or 22. So I don't know what age it was. But do you feel, when you meet someone like this face to face, you get to know them even for just a few minutes of conversation. Do you feel that they should be sort of cast aside from the progress of history and devote their lives to the museum of the beliefs of their ancestors? That they should spend their time tending the fire that was lit by their parents and grandparents, and indeed justifying and making excuses for that tradition, instead of, frankly, demolishing that tradition, disbelieving that tradition, being at least open to, adopting and taking on new perspectives. So I just mentioned, we have 31 people in the audience, which is great. It's a totally unannounced, unplanned live stream. If you guys want to take a moment to hit the thumbs up button, it'll help more people discover the live stream and join the conversation. This is very unusual. I normally have a whole bunch of comments rolling in. I have no comments visible at my end at the moment. It could be that you're all just flabbergasted by what I have to say, but I wonder if it's just a technical problem at Google right now, because I'm actually not seeing any of your comments pop up, but I dare not interrupt or restart the live stream for this reason. So anyway, look, sorry. So I warned you at the beginning of the video that I was going to take some time just to put a human face on it, and to give it this sense of scale, this sense of immediacy. Now, look, you continue with the same example. This young woman. I could tell you various things about her. It's just someone I met and spoke to once, but still I remember it. With anyone like this, what if they tell you, these are the kinds of conversations I had, what if they tell you that, they are interested in Buddhist philosophy and they really wanted to study that, but they dare not do so because of their parents or their grandparents' wishes or their status in the church, their religion? What if they tell you that they were interested? Sorry, that's the sort of conversation I would have. I was a scholar of Buddhism at the time. What if they tell you, that they are interested in this or that political theory, political ideology? I come out of a political science background. They were interested in more radical political ideas and different approaches to economics, but they dare not look into it because of who their parents and grandparents are, because of their status in this religion and this tradition that they're devoted to perpetuating. And indeed, for women especially, this is honestly, it's true of men also. It's just less viscerally obvious that they're going to devote their lives to reproducing the same cultural values, the same myths, the same legends, the same misconceptions in the next generation. So men do within any one of these religious identities also. And even if the men are out earning money in the market and the women are housewives, that's still why the men are earning money. That's still why they're devoting their time to business, is to come home and devote themselves to tending this fire, as I've put it, to keeping the lives of the current and the next generation inside this museum of ossified cultural values. And someone like this might say to you that they had some particular aspiration in life. Maybe it was to go into the sciences and conduct research to find a cure for cancer. Let's do something a bit corny. Maybe it was to read and write about the philosophy of Aristotle. Do something corny. And maybe the person we're talking to was quite shallow, and really what they wanted to do was become a fitness instructor at a gym and have an Instagram profile and be adored for their appearance, But, that's probably, statistically, it's more likely that that's what they're fantasizing about, rather than finding a cure for cancer or studying and publishing articles about the philosophy of Aristotle. Just talking about the common man here. They might have had some dreams for some other life. Maybe they wanted to join the army and see the world, but all of those dreams are inaccessible forever. They'll never even get to dabble in them enough to become disillusioned with them and find better dreams, you know what I mean? Because of their commitment to that cultural tradition, because of the extent to which they feel beholden to it. Now, let me just ask, where do the excuses stop? If we say it's okay for you to live in ignorance, it's okay for you to never have this kind of education, never have this kind of experience, never enter the workforce. It's okay for you to never do this because you come from this culture. And you see how fine the difference there. It's because you're born into this culture. It's almost racism. Okay, well that's fine for you. And in the so-called mosaic of our multicultural society, that's fine for you and you and you and you. It's fine for all these people who fit into these different boxes to live a life of pious, self-righteous ignorance. Do we extend that to medicine? Do we feel that there's one set of scientific conclusions about medicine, about health, that apply to all humanity equally, or not? And what does or not mean? What is the alternative there? Now, this critique actually applies to a great many people who think that they're atheist, think that they're secular, think that they have modern values, that they aren't a member of any cult, just as much as it applies to people who, wear the costume of an Orthodox religion every day. I think in the 21st century, we're at a sort of transitional period of not really wanting to admit to ourselves how little freedom of belief there is, how little freedom of religion there is when it's applied to medicine, health, and nutrition, and when it's then applied to everything else, at least as a matter of allegory, if not directly in and for its own sake. We all seem to be willing to pretend that it's perfectly fine and healthy and normal for a Muslim family to circumcise their son, for a Jewish family to circumcise their son. Now, there's absolutely nothing normal or healthy about circumcision. What we're really saying and offering this justification or excuse is that belief, personal belief, trumps, supersedes, is superior in priority to the facts of science. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, pretty much every week, if not every month, I see people uploading YouTube videos talking about their decision to take stimulants like Adderall, to take mood-altering, mind-altering drugs, whether they are called antidepressants or antipsychotics or some other form of prescription medication. I see people also justifying their decision to use illegal drugs, recreational drugs, which may, if they're not legal, they may be tolerated, things like marijuana. And they appeal to the same fundamental logic. It is really a kind of multiculturalism. And it's culture, in our context, hippies are in effect another culture unto themselves. There are these people who live with excuses for smoking marijuana that are passed down to them by their parents and grandparents. And many of them will tell you that. I've met people who will say openly that they smoke marijuana with their parents, if not their grandparents, that they have been assured that they believe that this is harmless or even that this is good for their health. There are women who will tell you in the same terms that they smoked marijuana during pregnancy. There are women who will tell you that they smoked cigarettes during pregnancy. There are women who will tell you that they drank alcohol during pregnancy and that their parents did before them. And this has the power of a continuous cultural tradition. And how dare you question it? How dare you insult them and their whole lineage, their whole cultural tradition? Needless to say, this is applied also to the minutiae of the human diet, where somehow the notion that something is traditionally considered healthy has superior priority to any mere facts of science you may introduce into the discussion to disrupt it. Now, let's be honest here too. The facts of science for the vast majority of normal people are unknowable. Babe, could you grab your book off the top? Just going to give an example. So this is a book that's actually been mentioned on the channel many times over many years. This is called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. So this is primarily about the evils of mind-altering prescription drugs, primarily. But it's also a story of how people justify their addiction to these drugs. All kinds of people. The doctors who make the prescriptions, the marketing companies that make money out of it, the corporations that profit from it, ordinary people, like you and I. I do not mean in a shallow or catty sense that this is fundamentally similar to the world's religions. There is a kind of religiosity involved. There is a kind of self-righteous ignorance involved. And there's an assertion of your cultural identity in feeling that you're entitled to your own facts in the same way that the Christians are and the Muslims are and the Jews are. And somehow external facts presented by unbelievers, they don't intersect with, they don't interfere with your view of reality, or they ought not, that it's a fundamentally, immoral thing. When I was living in Saskatchewan, so if you guys don't know the geography of Canada, Saskatchewan is a large, underpopulated part of Canada where land is cheap and where there are many, many religious cult groups that have colonies. So still today, if you wanted to start a cult, if you want to start a separate community for people of your own beliefs, that's the kind of place you might go. Buy a farm, buy some wasteland or something, and start living there. But obviously, 100 years ago and 200 years ago, it was even cheaper. This is related to our history of genocide, in case you haven't guessed. I had face-to-face discussions with attractive young women there. And these young women, I think, were talking to me and were, in a very repressed way, flirting with me, precisely because I represented the outside world that they had been forbidden to have any kind of meaningful contact with. Now, everyone in my classes was really kind of older than you quote unquote should be to be a university student. Like, if you'd gone straight from high school into university. Now, there are different reasons for this, but the main one being that the university I was at and the particular classes I was in, they were predominantly for people who were unsuccessful in the conventional educational track. Like, people who had finished high school in the correct number of years with high grades, they would go to some other university. Let's put it. I had a lot of people in my classes who were 25. I had a lot of people in my classes who were 35. I had a lot of older students, but even the people who were relatively young, they tended to be 22 or 23, and to say that they'd had a few years as an alcoholic or something in between high school and college, they didn't really graduate high school in the right number of years. There was a lot of that. In Regina, Saskatchewan. So the actual women I'm thinking of, they were not 19 years old or something. They were into their 20s, and had a number of conversations with these young women. And you can imagine in that context where they are for the first time in their lives having a little bit of independence, a little bit of freedom of thought and action from the religious colony that had dominated their lives, the religious colony that probably selected their husband, or at least put them in the room with their choice of like 4 men. Well, there are 4 guys you can choose between, get to know them, you take your pick. It might not be as simple as arranged marriage, but where they'd lived their lives really with all of the meaningful decisions made for them. And then they meet and talk to someone like me. And there are different things about them that might, pardon me. There are different things about me that might interest them, that might excite their curiosity. They would know that I was somebody born and raised in Canada, but who had made a mercurial decision, made a sudden decision at one point in his life to quit his job and run away and move to Cambodia. And again, they wouldn't know all the details, but at some point in the classroom, they'd heard this about me. Some part of them, again, I'm not saying these women, if they were not part of a traditional culture, if they were not part of one of these subcultures in our multicultural society, I'm not saying they would have devoted themselves to finding the cure for cancer or reading the philosophy of Aristotle. But yeah, you know what? It probably crossed their mind. It probably crossed their mind at least. What if there were a better life out there somewhere? What if for just a couple years or for a couple of months, they could run away to Cambodia or run away to Thailand or run away to China or run away to Japan or something? If they could get out of the rusted cage of the culture they've been born into and think new thoughts and have new experiences and in some sense see the world. I don't think that's attributing, too vivid a fantasy life, to them. So that they were meeting me and they were aware that I was someone who in this way had lived. With particular women I talked to this way, I could add in particular details about what their own struggles in life were and how they perceive me. Now, by the way, so we're choosing a selection here where there is in our culture, in our politics, there's no racial distinction between them and I. We're all considered white people in Canada. But by the way, that's also endlessly debatable. In what sense is a Ukrainian person the same race as a Scottish person? Well, it's all bullshit. I mean, it's all just ideology. It's all culture. It's all politics. And me as someone who is perceived as an exotic Jew, my very Judaism, am I really the same race as any of these people who self-identify as white? But I'm just pointing out this is a context in which we can really talk about culturism very separately from racism. I'd have to go back more years to talk about an example of a Muslim woman who reached out to me this way. When I was still in Toronto, again, this comes down to my appearance, there were Muslim women, women born and raised in Muslim families, and they perceived me, I mean, again, Judaism, ethnically, the difference between someone being Jewish and someone being Arab is a rounding error in the mathematics of DNA. But they maybe perceive me as someone who might be Arab or who might be Iranian, and they're maybe drawn interest in me that way. I'm remembering just two women who were born and raised Muslim, and where they had these kinds of conversations with me. So again, you can imagine intellectually and politically and in terms of life experience, how I might represent to them the path they hadn't taken or the path they hadn't taken yet. Because here they were as university students with this freedom from their family, with these possibilities. But obviously just visualizing things. If you're thinking about me being in Saskatchewan and talking to young women who in a sense have their whole life ahead of them, right? Who are born and raised as white Christians of some kind. But some of these Christian groups, these are really crazy cult-like isolated Christian groups, right? Okay, so that's one scenario. And then think about also, I'm in Toronto and talking to someone who is of some kind, born to a traditional Muslim family, who ethnically in their appearance appears to some extent, Arab or, Pakistani or what have you, who ethnically appears to be non-white and who in their style of dress and so on may be distinguishing themselves from the white Western macro culture or colonial European culture, in a different way. All right. Now, in those conversations, what if I had the attitude, oh, no, you shouldn't question what your parents and grandparents and religious tradition have decided is best for you. Oh, no, you shouldn't think about any of these things you're asking me about at all. Oh, no. And why? Because you've been born into that culture, because you've been born into that race. Oh, no. These are good questions. These are good options for me to consider, but not for you. Some things are just off limits to you because of the circumstances of your birth. That would be a dismissive and contemptuous attitude, really quite similar to racism, really quite shockingly similar to racism. And we're all supposed to indulge in it for the sake of multiculturalism, for the sake of this greater whole that we're supposed to comprise with each tribe, with each confessional unit of their religion, comprising a separate piece in the mosaic with invidious, distinctions between each of them. Now, each of these people would have had different intellectual potential, different yearnings, different desires, different interests. And it's not for me to know them. It's not for me to know who has the potential in them to find a cure for cancer or to spend their life at least researching it. Who has it in them to go to Cambodia and do humanitarian work? Who has it in them to become a great writer or a great political leader? But, free thinking, freedom of thought, it's crucial to all of them, whether their dreams be pathetic and narrow and vain and shallow, whether they want to be another Instagram influencer, they want to do fitness, or whether it be something, profound, something of tremendous meaning for them in their lives, for society as a whole, or for the cluster of 50 or 500 people they manage to directly, influence. It's very easy to say, and you'll see why I'm saying about a young woman specifically. It's very easy to say about a young woman, oh, you have your whole life ahead of you. You can do anything. Okay. Not if you get married at 16. Not if you're pregnant and having children at age 16, 17, or 18, right? You don't have your whole life ahead of you. You have this one thing that you're allowed to do that's set down for you by your religion, by your cultural tradition, and then you're never going to have the opportunity to do anything else. You're never going to have the opportunity to go to Cambodia. You're never going to have the opportunity to see the world. You're never going to have the opportunity even to join the army or anything. You're never going to have, again, let's put in some shallow examples here. Maybe they wanted to work in fashion. Maybe they wanted to try their hand at designing and making clothes, being a creative person that way. I'm just trying to use some examples that aren't so much in my, my own area of expertise or inclination. Whatever it is they might have done or could have done. Maybe they wanted to be an artist. Maybe they wanted to be a comedian. It's a great example, actually. Whatever potential they could have had, all of it is suffocated. All of it is destroyed by culture. And there is a kind of racism. If you walk through the university halls and you see a young woman who is wearing the full Orthodox Muslim uniform or the full Orthodox Jewish uniform, and again, it's more subtle, but there are cues about women who are members of fundamentalist Christian organizations, a certain kind of dress. I don't know if you guys noticed this, certain kind of flower print dress and maybe a cross around their neck. You can meet women who are part of, forms of Christianity that are just as repressive, walking those. For you to walk through the halls and think, oh, there's no potential being wasted here. There's nothing being squandered. There's no tragedy. There's nothing being lost at all. There's no positive contribution she could have made to the world that's being lost because of what this culture has done to her. And the best thing for us as a society is to allow all of these subcultures to exist side by side, unchallenged, each one ruining the lives of its members, each one enforcing, the self-righteous ignorance of generations of the past on the present and the future in this terrible pattern. We lack the vocabulary to even speak in terms of the destruction of culture, the demolition of culture. And it's precisely the demolition of culture, the demolition of false cultural assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, that is the government's responsibility, that is the role of democracy, to open the way to any and every possible future. Right? I do not believe in destroying one specific culture in order to replace it with another. No, so in the same sense, I can think of any of these particular young women I spoke to. My point is not, oh no, you should quit Christianity and instead join Mormonism. You should instead have an arranged marriage and be part of a different oppressive particular religion. My point is not that people should leave Islam in order to join the Hutterites. Hutterites are a particular form of Christianity. No. And my point is not even that they should give up their beliefs, their cultural tradition in order to adopt my particular set of atheist, open-minded, my particular set of cultural values, if you want. because it's inescapable. No matter how much you reject cultural values, there are some that you continue to live by or espouse, just in the same sense that no matter how much you may reject one set of aesthetic standards or another, there's still a set of aesthetic standards you're living by. One has to wear clothes of one kind or another, no matter how much you may reject or revile the fashions of any particular religious or cultural tradition. You're still going to settle on some set of cultural values that you live by, even if it's with no such ideological or religious commitment to any of them at all. My point is not to demolish one thing in order to build another. The point is precisely to demolish the culture that constrains and oppresses you, so that you have the freedom of thought, the freedom of action, the freedom to sit and look at the future of your life like a blank sheet of paper and come up with any number of possibilities, many of which you may try and quickly become disillusioned with, and then find new possibilities, to put on this piece of paper. Now, it is conspicuous and it is quite intentional that I've been talking about young women as the examples of this. Let's briefly talk about old men by contrast. Okay, what's different when we talk about old men? What's different is precisely the extent to which older men will insist that they are not oppressed, but that they are the oppressor. Right? The extent to which old men will insist, no. Nobody has forced me into this. Nobody has cornered me into living by these beliefs. Nobody has forced me to close the door on these other options in my life. They will describe themselves and think of themselves and present themselves as if they have boldly and heroically taken on these cultural values themselves and chose them, and that they go around making that choice for other people whom they frankly dominate, terrify, and oppress. It's very, very difficult to get a 45-year-old man to think of himself as a victim of the culture of circumcision, right? And whether they are a member of a religion that forbids drinking alcohol or that basically encourages it and requires it at regular religious festivals. Again, you can be a devout Christian and you're drinking alcohol at all these events or whatever. When you talk to older men, they will insist that this wasn't something enforced upon them, but it's something that they embrace, that they espouse, and that they enforce on others. Whether that's that they force others to not drink alcohol, or that every year they go to this ceremony and they're the guy enforcing others to drink. Hey, this is our tradition. Get drunk, enjoy whatever it is. That they take on the role, of the oppressor. Now, obviously, this is a delusion. You could say to any one of these men, and I've engaged in this kind of Socratic dialogue all the time. Oh, okay, so if you hadn't been born into the particular family you were born into, and the family, of course, has cultural as well as racial and economic connotations, do you think you would have come up with this idea of circumcision all by yourself? Hypothetically, if you were raised as an orphan by a robot in a government orphanage, so there's a sense in which you have no culture at all, you're making it up as you go along. If you were raised, do you think one day you would have thought to yourself, you know what? I need to pay a surgeon to cut off part of my dick. You know what? I should force my sons and grandsons to also cut off part of their dick as a sign of their commitment to the Judeo-Christian God. You've never read the Bible. You've never been told or taught. It's never been inculcated into you that this is virtuous by your parents. Of course, it's ridiculous. And of course, the very men who think of themselves as the oppressors are themselves oppressed in an ongoing cycle. That is what we call culture. And culture is precisely what trains you to regard your oppression as something you are not ashamed of, but something you're proud of, right? And down to the smallest details of religious tradition. To give you an example, many religions have this. By the way, I could use Irish Catholics as an example of this, or I could use Muslims from from Saudi Arabia. The idea that walking in a circle around an object, circumambulation, is something profound and holy, that it's an act of introspection and so on. Did you make that up? Who taught you to walk in a circle this way. So just mentioned it's a form of religious devotion. It's quite widespread. We have things similar to it in Buddhism. But this idea of walking in a circle around an object, often, having your hands clasped together, perhaps mumbling in prayer or chanting, a text of, the idea of circumambulation, of walking in a circle. If you were raised in an orphanage by a robot, do you think you would have been that? Do you think it could be that you saw your grandfather doing this and you asked him why he was doing it? He explained to you that this was the most divine and holy and wonderful thing, and that that every man is part of your manhood, so that, perhaps this grandfather also said to you, well, a lot of young people these days can't appreciate it. There are a lot of teenagers who just think it's stupid, but they're not like you. You're special. You're smarter than the other teenagers. You're more profound. You can appreciate our tradition. You have to carry it on. You have to be. This stuff gets to you, man. I mean, this stuff, you don't think you're having this burden. No. This is precisely what makes you better than your friends. Your friends, they laugh and jeer at some of us who are carrying on the traditions of our grandfathers, but not you. You're special. Sorry, to come back to the female example, it's not the case. It's not the case that every girl raised in that colony will remain a virgin until marriage and get married at 16 and so on, and be raising a child. No. The girls who carry that on, they think they're special. They think they're superior to the other girls. I swear. I mean, obviously this is to my knowledge, but if you know people from those small towns, there are always a few girls. There are a few girls who ran away to Los Angeles or ran away to Vancouver, and maybe they even got a job in a strip club or something. Even if that's not true, that's what people in the small town say, right? Like, I remember a guy who told me in depth, it was a small town, and there was one girl who was officially the prettiest girl in the small town, and she ran away to become a stripper. But in every one of those religious communities, there are stories about the fallen, the castaways, the rebels, the people who went elsewhere to live a different life. Oh, but you're not like them. You're better than them. This is the tremendous power that culture has in our lives. And we take up the oppression of ourselves and others, not with a sense that we are the victims, but that we are the victors, that it's something we can and should be proud of. And tell me, in the 21st century, who is going to break this cycle? Who is going to challenge it? It has to be the government, and it has to be a democratic government. It has to be through democracy. This is the year 2021. People are still questioning the morality of the government forcing cultural minorities to accept vaccines. This is not a trivial aspect of democracy. Okay? This is not something peripheral to democracy, right? This is the beating heart of democracy. Okay? We had a meeting. We let the public speak down at the Pnyx. We made a decision, and now you have to live with the consequences, or else be exiled. Just digress slightly here. You may know my preference is for direct democracy rather than indirect. If you want to jump in there, Melissa is participating in her way off camera here. One of the best recorded examples of how democracy worked in ancient Athens is the Peloponnesian War. It's basically the history of wars between Athens and Sparta. And to some extent, by the way, Persia is involved in all these wars. Now, you may not know this if you haven't done the reading, okay? It is not the case that everyone in Athens supported the Athenian side in those wars. And it's kind of several overlapping and intermixed wars. There were people born and raised in Athens who sympathized more with Sparta. There were people born and raised in Athens who went and fought for the Spartan army. There were people born and raised in Athens who went to fight for Persia, for the Persian army, for the Medes. Okay, there's some of the most famous. Okay, there was free thinking. You had a choice. So there's a debate down at the Pnyx, PNYX, if you don't know the meaning of the word. There's a debate down at the Pnyx, and there are different options. Athens can be at peace with Sparta, like at different times. Athens can be in an alliance with Sparta against the Persians. Athens could be in an alliance with the Persians against the Spartans. That happened repeatedly, even though we think of the Persians as if they were the constant. And you know what? There's a debate, there's a discussion, there's a vote. And once that vote is taken, either you accept the decision that's been made democratically and you fight on the same side as everyone else, or you are exiled, or you are killed. Now, I don't have it with this debate. Could you grab Machiavelli? It could be. Oh no. It'll be there. Machiavelli's Discourses. If you can't get it, you can't get it. There we go. Okay. Just mention Machiavelli is mostly famous for a book called The Prince, which I don't recommend reading, frankly. It's really overrated, The Prince. But he has a much longer and more substantive book called The Discourses. And actually, the parts of this book that are worth reading, it's not the whole length. You can kind of read it. There's some sections you can flip through, and there's others where you really want to slow down and read intensely. So you're saying it's not really a cover-to-cover great book, but worth reading, and some sections of it tremendously worth reading, tremendously inspirational. And Machiavelli's an interesting character. He is pro-democracy, anti-oligarchy, anti-monarchy, anti-aristocracy. He is very fundamentally a pro-democracy writer, which many people don't know because they only read The Prince. So his philosophy says here is quite interesting. Machiavelli is the most brutally honest guy about the extent to which democracy requires violence. And to sustain a republic, to sustain even a mixed republic, a republic that is partly democratic, because that's mostly what he talks about, because in real life you very rarely have direct democracy or any society even as democratic as Athens. Athens was not a perfect democracy. We can list off its imperfections, but we rarely even approach the level of democracy that was at Athens. But the level of violence required against your own people to have a democracy, it's terrifying. And Machiavelli is one of the guys saying, hey, I'm not terrified. Machiavelli is living through an unbelievably dismal, violent period in the history of Europe. And he's saying, we'd be better off going back to that kind of violence, the kind of violence they had in ancient Rome, the kind of violence they had in ancient Athens, instead of the violence we're stuck with now in the Dark Ages. Instead of the kind of violence that's necessary to maintain a monarchy or an oligarchic, aristocratic system of government. He'd rather have that democratic kind of violence, right? You are not allowed to decide whether or not drinking alcohol during pregnancy is safe or healthy. You're not, right? Now, just with this one example, any of these examples, talk about circumcision, talk about drinking alcohol during pregnancy. And by the way, guys, just another one, because I've seen this my whole life. I remember seeing this in France. I remember seeing this in Scotland. Smoking cigarettes during pregnancy will more than double the chances that your child will be diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, ADHD is not a biologically real condition. It's not. It's a set of behaviors. That's all it is. It's a stereotype, really. Okay? But there are children who are diagnosed with attention deficit disorder so that they can get some kind of help, so that they can get some kind of special education, and in many cases, so that they can be put onto drugs like Adderall so that they can participate in normal classroom life. I do not reify attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'm not here to tell you this is a biologically real condition. Okay? Isn't it interesting that smoking cigarettes during pregnancy would double the chances that your child has something wrong with them, has some kind of limited cognitive function that would get diagnosed as ADHD, result in them getting special help, special classes. Now, look, guys, nicotine. What are the effects of nicotine on a developing embryo? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Something that smoking cigarettes and smoking marijuana has in common with drinking alcohol will just be the effects on how much oxygen the developing fetus or embryo is getting. All right. There are issues here with the circulation of blood, with how much oxygen is being carried in the blood. Do you want to live in a society where everyone gets to have their own science? Do you want to live in a society where everyone gets to have their own beliefs, go unchallenged, and Trump? I'm sorry to use Trump as a verb, not using it as a proper name here, but it is useful, where your cultural identity, your beliefs, your traditions, even what your grandparents told you, what you hold to be sacred, where that trumps, that exceeds in importance the facts of science or the very real and measurable consequences for yourself, for your children, frankly, for the future of humanity. All right. In the same way that the stupidity of the mother in drinking alcohol during pregnancy or smoking cigarettes during pregnancy is inculcated upon the child. The child will be raised with justifications and excuses for that stupidity, and they'll be molded to repeat that stupidity. This is the same way in which culture reproduces itself across generations. And I've never had anyone debate this with me. I've never had anyone dispute it with me. I've never had anyone, like whether by email or face to face, I have never had anyone who was actually motivated to try to convince me that there is a point to the perpetuation of culture when they are asked simply, what is the point? Culture is tragic. You know, you can justify the mistakes made by your parents. You can justify the decisions made by your grandparents. You can sort of try to glorify the self-righteous ignorance of your cultural tradition, whether it's the immediate generation or many before. But when you turn around and look forward, when you look to the future, you know, what would be the point of having these same mistakes or having these same beliefs perpetuated into the future? Whether we think of those in terms of the aesthetic details, a cultural tradition of how pottery is made, how pottery is supposed to look, or we're thinking about these things that are so easily and verifiably wrong, medical facts, you know, medical facts that relate to your physical, mental, and emotional health, you know. Now, I just want to say, you know, I sympathize with religious people. I sympathize with religious people more than you can know, because I think that the religions of the world, great and small, lead people to ask really important questions. The problem is that they raise people to presume that the answers to those questions were already discovered by their grandparents or great-grandparents, that they're not here to be asked and answered by ourselves multiple times within one generation, that they're unsettled, that the door remains open, that the page remains blank, you know, again and again, forever, that there isn't one answer. You know, I'll give an example that many of you may be surprised for me to choose. You know, religious people grow up with a concept of humility. I think is actually very interesting and profound. You know, and by and large, people who are not religious have no concept of humility. My parents were both communists. I'm an anti-communist. But, you know, they had no concept of humility, none, shockingly so, by the way. And so, you know, for me as a young man, it was really interesting as a kind of foreign concept to explore and understand humility. I mean, another religious idea, I could list up a whole bunch. The idea of detachment, you know. There were all kinds of ideas I got from religion. There were important questions. Now, you know, I can ask you a total point, what does humility mean in your life? What does it mean to be humble? What is the significance of it? You know, What is the positive advantage of cultivating humility? And then what are the disadvantages? Right? Perhaps it's better, in some ways at least, to be a recklessly narcissistic Instagram model or something, to be beautiful and know that you're beautiful, or handsome and know that you're handsome, and to play that advantage, to the fore. I don't think humility is something that has value in and of itself, right? So religion can lead people to ask meaningful questions that have meaningful answers in their lives. But nothing could be more mentally deadening. Nothing could be more destructive than to live with the assumption that the meaning of humility, what it requires and what it entails in your life, is something already written down in this book. That the answer was something already established when your grandparents joined this religion, and that it's obligatory on you to follow exactly the same steps, of what it means to be a humble person. Now, humility is not meaningless. It's not. I heard an interview with a medical doctor a few weeks ago, and I think it is relevant to mention he is a very good-looking man. He, apart from being born good-looking, he takes a lot of care with his appearance. And as a medical doctor in the United States of America, he probably gets a lot of attention from women because he's wealthy and successful and good-looking, and so. And he talked about his recognition of his own prejudice against clients, sick people who come into his office for help, who are fat, ugly, unkempt, as we say in English, who are not making an effort with their appearance, who may smell bad. He mentioned just a detail, a guy who came in wearing blue jeans, and there was mud around the cuffs at the bottom of the blue jeans. There was some mud, near his boots at the bottom of his blue jeans. That people who don't answer to those things. Okay, there's humility in being a medical doctor, right? And the way in which humility really matters as a doctor, as a teacher, as an authority figure, as in whatever position you have in your life. I used to do humanitarian work, all right? And I was very different from other people doing humanitarian work. Many of the people doing humanitarian work really had the deep-seated attitude that they were wealthy and they represented a superior level of scientific education. And they were coming to do humanitarian work to bring truth to the conquered. Here are these poor third world people, and they just don't know and don't understand the things that we wealthy, highly educated people know, and we're bringing to them this civilization. My attitude was much more like an anthropologist doing research. I was really interested in what these people had to teach me. I mean that totally unpretentiously. I mean that with a sense of humility. I could give numerous examples, but I thought that someone who had survived the Indochina wars, someone who had survived the Americans dropping this enormous number of bombs on their village, who had survived the rise and fall of communism, who had a mixed background, obviously, in agriculture and guerrilla warfare, and this extreme poverty and disease, and in solving problems with their hands. Even if these people were illiterate, that they actually had a great deal to teach me. They knew many things about life I would never know. Now, also at that time, I was a scholar of Buddhism. I felt correctly that these people knew something about Buddhism I didn't know. To some extent, I'm a de facto scholar of communism. I'm an anti-communist. I think these people knew something about communism. I didn't know. Where I'm going there with a kind of humility that really makes me open to learning from these people. Now, of course, you're also going to learn about their foolishness. You're also going to learn about all the things they're wrong with. Oh, great example. Coming back to the comparison with medicine. So where I was in northern Laos, Southeast Asia, poverty-stricken, war-torn, people, where I was doing humanitarian work, people drank nail polish remover. they specifically mixed nail polish remover with sugarcane juice. Culturally, that was normal. So, now, how can anyone be unaware that they're basically drinking paint thinner? There were a number of cultural practices that are just totally ruinous to people's health, and I have no sympathy or patience with this whatsoever. I'm not gonna sit there and say, well, you people have your own way of doing things. No, this is completely horrifying. But nevertheless, I am suggesting to you that humility, which is a religious concept, really has profound significance in our lives. And I got to see the difference. I could see the difference between myself and other people doing humanitarian work. I could see the difference between myself and other people doing Buddhist research and Buddhist scholarship. Oh, did you think you came here to preach unto others, or do you think you came here to learn from others? Do you think these people really have something to teach you? And I do live my life with that kind of humility. I meet the kind of ignorant rednecks. And when I talk to them, whatever, they may be a plumber, or they may be doing whatever kind of job they do. I actually really do have those conversations with the assumption that they have a great deal to teach me about life. They have things to teach me about areas of life that I have not researched. I don't begin the conversation thinking, oh, this person knows more about Aristotle than I do. I don't believe that. But they will know things about life in other areas and other provinces. They will have other experiences they can share with me that I really do value, or I really have the humility to recognize what they have to bring into my life, even if it's on this small scale. Okay. So I just say, as an atheist, as a radical, nihilistic, dissident intellectual who openly talks about destroying Christianity, I still sympathize with religious people and their attitudes more than you could know, because I sympathize with the extent to which religion raises really important and meaningful questions in their lives. What I don't sympathize with is the way in which religion provides answers. I have never once had a single atheist or so-called skeptical YouTube channel cooperate or collaborate with me in any positive way whatsoever. Several of them, if you've watched the channel for a long time, you may know, several of them have attacked and denounced me and insulted me in crude terms. I have never once had any positive collaboration with anyone who considers themselves to be part of atheism as a movement. All right. I think, just pause to clarify, that's because of multiculturalism. It is absolutely part of the multicultural mentality. In the same way that we encourage one another by saying, oh, well, I personally wouldn't drink alcohol. I know that alcohol causes brain damage. I personally wouldn't take Adderall. I know that it's an addictive drug that causes brain damage. I know that the medical benefits are largely illusory and the disadvantages are all too scientific. I personally wouldn't smoke marijuana. But here's the motto of 21st century multiculturalism. But you do you. I personally wouldn't want to be 200 pounds overweight. But if it makes you happy, you do you, right? This is the tapestry of our tolerant society. This is the mosaic, right? It's not just narrowly defined religious and cultural beliefs that are supposed to be justified and passed unquestioned and be permitted. It's any belief whatsoever, right? That's how these things extend. The so-called atheist activists, the so-called skeptics, what they want is only to have one more tile in the mosaic, one little square that will sit next to the Vietnamese subculture and the Saudi Arabian subculture and the Hutterite subculture and the devout Catholic subculture. They just want to have their own little square in the multicultural mosaic and to feel that they're superior to everyone else in exactly the same way that the Catholics feel superior to them, in exactly the same way that the devout Muslims feel superior to them. They want that derision to be mutual. And they want to have a fundamentally mutually derisive society in which the invidious distinctions between each tile comprising the mosaic are smoothed over with this attitude already alluded to of, hey, you do you, right? Yeah. I remember a woman who was not Jewish, but who was, shall we say, a witness to the Jewish Holocaust, describing passionately how she had tried to get food provided to Jewish children. It's not worth describing the whole scenario in World War II. This is kind of a refugee scenario. And she was saying to the people in charge of the Christian charity that was handing out food only to Christians, she said, don't you realize their stomach doesn't know the difference? Like whether they eat or starve has nothing to do with their, ideological commitment to Christianity, versus Judaism. And she described just the hard, hateful reactions of these women, some of whom were nuns, but others were just, true believing Christians involved in this charitable practice of, starving some children and feeding others, on this basis. Your stomach doesn't know the difference. Your lungs, your brain, your body chemistry doesn't know the difference, right? We're using these drugs or any of these examples, right? Either it is right or it is wrong. And if it's wrong, then it's equally wrong for everyone. Of course, it's very convenient that we're living through a period of time in which there is almost zero democracy, in the Western world. Could you imagine living in a society where you had a debate and the final conclusion was that circumcision should be illegal for everyone except the people who believe in it? Does that make sense? That seemed like something the Panics or like some kind of really authentic direct democracy would. Nobody should cut off part of their dick unless you believe in it, unless it's part of your religion, unless it's part of your culture. Right? That's exactly the contradiction we're all living with. Right? And the ridiculous position of the other atheist YouTubers, the other secular activist YouTubers, is that they continue this to perpetuate this pattern. They continue to perpetuate the pattern. Oh, no. Christmas should continue to be celebrated by the people who believe in it. Circumcision should continue to be celebrated by the people who believe in it. Every imaginable, cultural tradition that Muslims should carry on being Muslims, just not us atheists. That we should have our own, our own place in the panoply of minority traditions. I don't think this is what all atheists believe, but I think it's interesting that the people who become activists, who become voices for and representatives for the movement and have YouTube channels, the people who end up in those positions and end up being supported with considerable amounts of money, as far as I know, by the way, in terms of donations, I think it's significant that's the pattern, All right. I'm going to close this part of the video. I'm going to address kind of one more category, and then I'm going to wrap it up. I have not been able to read your comments in the audience. I assume that's just an error on YouTube's part. Again, if you want to take a moment and hit the thumbs up button, it might help a few more people discover the video, but no big deal either way. I make about $200 a month out of this hobby. And obviously, if I had been motivated by money, I would not have said half of the things in this video that I've said. This is no way to earn a living on social media. I do this because I think it's the right thing to do. I do this for all the reasons I've already talked about earlier in this video. I do this to have a positive impact, on the lives of the 15 or 50 people I can really meaningfully change through my own influence, through my own example, however you want to put it. I do this to make the world a better place, to change society, to change the future of the society I live in and so on, to the extent that I can. But you know what? Most of all, I do this to change myself. The most fundamental choice I've got to make is who I'm going to be and who I'm going to become. And it changes, right? It changes year by year. And many in the audience, you may not feel this or may not feel it yet. If in watching my YouTube videos, some of your attitudes have changed, if you've become unwilling to make some of the compromises you lived with before, I think you'll be amazed how within the passage of time, within the passage of a few years, how who you are changes also, without you even making a decision, without you making any sacrifice. You'll become a different person. Frankly, just because you've thought some of these things through thoroughly that maybe you didn't think through before they were animated, shall we say, here on my YouTube channel. The way in which we change is not always voluntary, although it's always intellectual. Have you ever reflected about a relationship in your life that you never made the decision to forgive someone, but you discovered with the passage of time that you had forgiven them? You don't always choose to forgive people. Sometimes you just forgive people. You don't always choose the way in which your own character changes. And why forgive someone in that? There are many reasons, but one scenario that's common enough that many of you've probably felt this way. If you're past the age of 30, one of the reasons why we forgive people is that we realize that the reason we resented them before was bullshit. Looking back at it now, my reason for being so angry, looking back now. Okay. In the same way, without you making any decision at all to change, without you making any sacrifice, without you making any commitment, who you are will change simply through the realization and recognition that things you made excuses for before are bullshit. I say this again and again in writing and in my YouTube videos. I'm currently producing the final draft of my book. The excuses are harder to quit than the thing itself. To quit making excuses for something, to quit making excuses for your own culture, to quit making excuses for your own religion, right? To quit making excuses for the decisions your parents made, your grandparents made. That's much harder. That's much harder than changing your own behaviors, changing your own habits in life. There are so many people raised Muslim who start drinking alcohol and eating pork. They just start living a modern life once they're in their own apartment and have their own job, right? Like when they go back and visit their parents, they don't do those things, right? But what they can't quit is making excuses for the cultural identity they want to perpetuate. It's much harder, right? And of course, you can quit making the excuses and you could continue living the lifestyle. So you could continue refusing to drink alcohol, refusing to eat pork. That's really the deeper challenge and change. And just admitting to yourself, you might not choose, you might not decide, you might not sacrifice. Just admitting to yourself, this is bullshit. With the passage of time, it changes who you are. Have you ever known a young woman who was passionate about fashion, about designer clothes? They may not choose, they may not make a choice, they may not sacrifice. They may reach a point in their lives where they start regarding fashion and designer clothes as bullshit. My point is, this is not unique to religion. I say in your personal relationships, you resent that person so much for something they did to harm you in the past, whatever it is, and then you regard that as bullshit, and you find that you've forgiven them. Okay. In wrapping up the first half of this video, or the first 9/10, I don't have that much more to say. In what sense is culture a tragedy? In what sense am I presenting multiculturalism, therefore, as something tragic? You have to have a clear sense of human potential that's counterposed to culture. As soon as we recognize that, as soon as we recognize the humanity of people who are members of these rival religions and rival cultures, then we can recognize the extent to which each and every culture really is bad and evil and wrong, right? Now, some of you may feel I had a great advantage in life in being raised in a free-thinking, quote-unquote, free-thinking atheist household. Okay, my parents were communists. Right? My parents made excuses for Joseph Stalin, for Mao Zedong, for Lenin. That's what I grew up with. That's what I had to challenge and I had to overturn. Okay, so people who make excuses for saying a prayer before they eat dinner. Another very visceral example: children who are taught to say a prayer before they write a test in class, before they write the math test, before they write the science test, so that they'll get a higher grade. Because these are the ways in which we live with, beliefs and traditions. Each and every one of us had something to challenge in the culture we were raised in, had something to overturn, right? It's possible you've known someone. What I'm going to say now is kind of parallel to my critique of video games. It's possible you've known someone who was so mentally disabled, who was so severely limited in their cognitive ability that you just think, you know what? There's no point in trying to convince this guy to stop praying. There's no point in convincing this guy that when he talks to God, he's just talking to himself. This guy is so mentally disabled, he's so mentally limited, that we're just going to step back and let him keep living his life that way. So I say this is parallel to some of the questions I've raised with video game addiction and video game playing. It is possible you know some young man who is so disabled that you think, well, like this guy, maybe he can never read a book. Maybe he's really that disabled. He's so mentally limited. Well, then in that context, maybe there's no harm in stepping back and letting him play video games, because he can never read a book. He can never have a job. He can never have a career. He can never make progress, in other ways. If you really know someone who's that severely mentally disabled. I've mentioned this before. One of my own brothers is so severely mentally disabled, he has never spoken a single sentence in the English language. He can't speak. He can basically eat. It has been claimed to me about that brother, I don't know this, that if you go back and visit him several times, he won't recognize you. He just sees you as a person. He can't remember and distinguish individual people. That's been claimed to me about him. But I mean, this is really severe mental disability. What is the judgment you're making about someone? Let's just say you had a twin brother, or sorry, if you're a female, you have a twin sister. Let's say you had a twin brother or a twin sister who has exactly the same intellectual potential that you do, the same capacity for moral responsibility, the same capacity to make the world a better place. Would you look at that twin brother and say, you know what? It's fine for you to spend the rest of your life smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, playing video games. Like, it's fine for you to do that because, hey, you do you, but not me. I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard. Would it be fine for you to look at your own twin brother, your own twin sister, and make the judgment, you know what? It's fine for you to join this cult, to join this religion where you're going to get married and pregnant at age 16, or if it's a guy, you're going to get married and start raising a kid with a girl at age 16, and for you to live your whole life spending all your energy and efforts justifying and continuing and perpetuating the elements of this culture in your style of dress, in your household, in the fastidious habits that define every meal, right? In your calendar full of religious occasions, in the prayers you say morning, noon, and night, in the songs you sing, and in all the songs you refuse to listen to. You can't listen to the radio, you can't watch movies, you have to live your whole life in this very narrow, culturally defined space, rigorously devoted just to living out these religious ideals. Would you look at your own twin brother or twin sister, someone who's your equal intellectually in every way? Would you look at them and say, you know what? That's fine for someone like you, but not me. I want to live my life answerable to some kind of higher standards. I want to hold myself to a higher standard. I want to pursue some kind of excellence, even if I have no idea what it is. Even if it is not something as specific as finding the cure for cancer or writing a book about the philosophy of Aristotle. You may have no particular ambitions in life, and yet you have ambition you have some sense of, some feeling for your own human potential, that there must be something better for you to do in your life, even if it's just that you're turning away from these other things that would limit it, right? So this is ultimately an argument about human potential. And if we can see, if we can sense, if we can feel, if we can appreciate that human potential in others, right, then we must see it as a tragedy, that they have wrapped their faces and wrapped their bodies in the symbols of these religious traditions, that they have devoted themselves to the perpetuation of culture. Now, throughout this video, just to be brief, I've mostly been talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I've drawn on examples people I've known face to face. Obviously, we could have talked about Mormonism. We could have talked about Scientology. And I said in the earlier video I made on the same topic, the earlier video that has multiculturalism in the title, I said there very clearly that even though it is more subtle to perceive, this same critique can and should be applied to Buddhism. It can and should be applied to Hinduism. I know a great deal. I was a former expert in Buddhism. I know a great deal about Buddhism and Hinduism. I could talk about Jainism. The problem is the video will be much longer because I'd really have to explain a lot of things about these religions to you. Just people in the audience will not come here with the level of familiarity. And I just mentioned, I said I've been unable to cooperate with other atheist channels. When I started this channel, I completely assumed my main purpose would be the critique of Buddhism, would be talking about Buddhism from an atheist perspective as a former scholar of Buddhism. I never found anyone I could work with. I never had encouragement. I only had discouragement. And what you hear instead, again, from the so-called atheists, the so-called secular activists, all of them want to perpetuate these cultural traditions. All of them want to believe that meditation and yoga and Ayurvedic medicine. Oh, there's a great example of pseudoscience. Oh, do you think different cultures are allowed to have different medicines? Do you believe eating mercury, eating the liquid metal mercury, do you think that's justifiable by religion? Do you think that's okay for a culture other than your own? All this stuff and forcing yourself to vomit, putting a towel down your throat, unbelievably horrendous, yogic traditions and Ayurvedic traditions and so on. Oh, you believe in multiculturalism, applying that to medicine in India. Oh, it gets scary quick. Anyway, I just say I would really have to make a much longer video to talk about Buddhist traditions, plural, or any particular Buddhist religion this way. So I just say, when you were walking down that hall or when you were walking down the street, if you dismiss the human potential, the intellectual potential, the political potential, the creative potential of these other people, just creativity. Again, you're not necessarily finding the cure for cancer. Maybe you're going to be a painter. Maybe you're going to be a poet. Maybe you're going to write, write manuscripts like Shakespeare, whatever you're going to do. Maybe you're going to be a journalist, write something meaningful as a journalist. If you are walking past people who wrap themselves in the symbols of religion, whether that be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, who are living their lives in this narrow way, being beholden to the errors and self-righteous ignorance of their own ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, going back to time immemorial, or possibly just their own parents converted to Islam. Could you be just one generation ago? This is actually for you. If you think nothing is lost there, then you are making a judgment on them. You are in effect saying, you're not my twin brother or my twin sister. You're not my equal in intellectual potential. There's nothing lost with you making the wrong decision, that you're willing to dismiss and diminish everything they could do in their lives, right? You're making the decision that basically they are as cognitively impaired as someone for whom nothing better is possible anyway. So why not let them continue talking to their imaginary friend? Why not let them continue living their lives in this terrible, hopeless, dead-ended way, right? So I'll end the video by responding to a comment that was in the comment section with my last video. This challenges the whole multicultural paradigm from a different perspective. Someone commented, and it's completely understandable. Someone commented that they still think we should have multiculturalism as far as cuisine is concerned, as far as restaurants are concerned. That's obviously it's a very sympathetic counterclaim. It's very sympathetic counterargument, right? So the point is here, in the year 2021, almost every corner of the world has Chinese restaurants, Indian restaurants. Remarkably, everywhere I go in the world, I see Ethiopian restaurants, a very specific culture of cuisine, that there should be French restaurants and so on. It's fair to say that one of the distinctions between a major city and a small town of no importance is the extent to which there is this kind of cultural diversity in cuisine. Okay. What does it mean, though, really, when you presume or assert that Indian food should be or has to be cooked by Indian people? That Chinese cuisine should be or has to be cooked by Chinese people? There's a very strange there's a very strange trivialization of precisely the cultures that we're supposedly trying to preserve or uphold under the heading of multiculturalism. This comes back to the question of the government structure of education and the extent to which multiculturalism really has been a kind of conspiracy to recruit low-wage labor into our societies, and this has not at all been a government policy of actually bringing in cultural leaders to represent their culture, to share their culture, to teach their culture, to benefit us, to enrich our culture with their own. If the Chinese language is worth learning, it cannot possibly be that it is only worth learning, only worth studying, only worth teaching to people who are ethnically Chinese. That makes no sense at all. That makes no sense at all. Why would you create Chinese language classes that are only by and for ethnically Chinese people? Now, I am ethnically Jewish. I have to bear persecution and racism my whole life because of this. It's always been an issue. It still is. If you think I'm joking, I'm not. Anti-Semitism is very real in the 21st century. And I have to, prepare my daughter to also deal with that her whole life long. I've had YouTube videos talking about this. So I live under this peculiar kind of scrutiny. All right. What would it mean if you said that it was only significant, that it was only culturally important for Jewish people to learn and study Hebrew, not non-Jewish people? The most important thing of all is to have people who are not Jewish learning Hebrew, precisely so that they can cross-examine, criticize from a detached outsider's perspective, from an atheist perspective, from a nihilist perspective, what is written in Hebrew, not just in the Bible. Of course, that's important. Of course, it's important to have secular, free-thinking, outside eyes, the eyes of people who are free-thinking, secular outsiders, cross-examining and criticizing what's in the Bible, what's going on in religious studies, basically to debunk the beliefs of people. We need people who can read the newspapers in modern Hebrew and who can basically say what bullshit it is. What's going on? We need people who can really, in a liberal way, in this sense, criticize and cross-examine what's going on within Israeli politics. That's tremendously important. Suddenly, it seems as if the outsider's perspective, and again, it's not really because you're from the outside, it's because you're an atheist, it's because you're a nihilist, it's because you have detachment, it's because you have these different motivations. Suddenly, that seems much more valuable than people within the culture perpetuating the culture, right? And as I say, what I'm challenging here is the assumption that what each of us ought to do morally is devote ourselves to maintaining a museum to the cultural values of our forefathers, our ancestors, right? Instead, I'm presenting a view of society that's dynamic and forward-looking, that is constantly engaged in the demolition of its cultural traditions and in the generation of new, as yet unknown cultural traditions. Right? Obviously, if it is worthwhile, if it is meaningful enough for someone to make the sacrifice to learn Chinese, it is more worthwhile. It is more rewarding. It's more important for all of us that non-Chinese people and the people who don't believe in China or Chineseness or don't believe in this culture, who don't value the culture, who don't value the religion, who don't value the tradition, it is much more important that detached outsiders learn Chinese and bring that critical perspective. And they got to bring that critical perspective to ancient texts that are the Chinese equivalent to the Bible. Chinese doesn't have a Bible, but it has ancient texts like Sun Tzu, Lord Shang, Confucius. There are these ancient hallowed texts, whatever, that they bring a critical outsider's perspective to communism in China, and that they even bring a critical outsider's perspective to the Bible, right? And then if it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing for anyone. Now, in case you hadn't guessed, I had to make these arguments about learning Pali for Buddhism, learning the ancient scriptural language for Buddhism. I had to make these arguments about people learning Cree and Ojibwe who are neither Cree nor Ojibwe. Right? What's the significance of knowing the Cree language or the Ojibwe language? Is it just so that people who happen to be born in that ethnic group can endlessly repeat the same rituals, live as if they're in a museum devoted to their ancestral past? No, there has to be something productive. There has to be something forward-looking. I'll always remember the shock that was on the face of one of my professors when I talked to him about writing the first chemistry textbook in Cree. I said, when are we going to start working on high school textbooks for chemistry and biology and like explaining the theory of evolution, in Cree, in Ojibwe? He had never thought of this. He didn't have a forward-looking view of the use of the language. But either we're going to do that or not at all. I had so many people, just to digress briefly, they got so excited and inspired when I told them the research project I was going to ask for research funding for. I said, well, the so-called elders in these tribal groups, people talk about them as if they're from 500 years ago. But human lifespan is what it is. So, well, the main thing they lived through was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and many of these remote First Nations reservations, really their experience of history had to do with military bases and missile silos and the threat of the Russians invading. That was really, and most of what they heard about on the radio and saw on TV, living in these remote areas. So I was going to do a research project based on the history of just the last 50 years. That was the kind of, people got so excited. And they didn't think of the language that way. They didn't think of talking to the tribal elders that way. They thought you went to the tribal elders and you asked them questions about what life was like 500 years ago. And then you just worshiped and preserved this idea of being a hunter who, rides in a canoe. Well, what I want to know about is, what did the atom bomb mean to you? Like if you are maybe old enough to remember when you were a child, first learning about the atom bomb being dropped on Japan. Then you moved into this long period of history of being terrified that your own country would be destroyed by the atom bomb, and you live near this military base and nothing else because it's remote areas of rural Canada. Okay. So again, I think this comes back to what I said at the very start of the video, where just the words we associate with culture, we think of cultural preservation. We don't think about cultural production. Okay. And cultural production absolutely entails cultural demolition. We destroy when we create, we destroy in order to create. So the notion that you're going to comprise a society of separate little tiles forming a mosaic in which Chinese people arrive and cook and prepare Chinese food, and they maybe raise their children going to a Chinese school where they learn to speak Chinese and then grow up and work in the same Chinese restaurant. This is wrong in a sense that's kind of profound and hard to perceive. Okay. If French cuisine really matters, I'm going to just narrow it down a bit, partly because of my own experience in life, partly because of my own expertise, probably because I'm vegan. Let's be more specific than French cuisine. French baking. Probably everyone in this audience knows if you go to Paris, the quality of a croissant, the quality of a loaf of bread is much higher than anywhere in Canada or the United States. I remember when I was in England, I was in Cambridge, England, and you could get French bread and croissants that were imported from Paris. You could pay. And I remember that one of the reasons I know is they had a sign up at the bakery saying, look, try to tell us 2 days in advance, because they said they're sent over by airplane. They were airlifting. Yeah. So in England is adjacent to France. They couldn't make bread and croissant. They couldn't make baked goods as well as the French. Okay. Now look, hey, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we're going to trivialize and dismiss and say, you know what? Bread, who cares? And I was asking, this is why before I was saying, look, reading Chinese, being able to read and understand Chinese politics or Chinese philosophy or Chinese history, obviously it matters. So obviously it matters that you have people like me who can engage in it from an outside detached perspective. With bread, there's a debate to be had here. If it matters to have bread and croissants baked at the same high standards as the French, then you need people learning how to do it in universities in Canada, in universities in Ireland, right? You need the training facilities to educate your own people in the cuisine of the French. You do not need a multicultural society in which you treat this as a birthright. That makes no sense at all. Now, we don't ask this probably just because it's trivial. What is the future of baking in Canada? What is the future of Chinese cuisine in Canada? What is the future of Indian food, Indian restaurants in Canada? It cannot be that you are perpetually importing immigrants who devote their lives to reproducing their own culture within yours, right? Why don't we instead? And again, I think this comes back to what my earlier video titled, the hierarchical and oppressive aspects of multiculturalism. Why wouldn't you go to India or go to China and say, hey, you know what? I'm not looking for people who will work for minimum wage. And if we're being honest, a lot of what goes on with multiculturalism and immigration, it's about paying people less than minimum wage. Oh, you know what? I'm not looking for someone who's willing to take a minimum wage job at the back of a kitchen making Indian food or Chinese food in Canada. You know what? I've come here to China or I've come here to India to recruit the most elite chefs you've got. I'm here to pay someone more than $100,000 a year to come to Canada and run a training and education program so we can educate the next generation of Canadians to do world-class Indian food, world-class Chinese food, so that we can make Chinese food just as well as the Chinese can. Of course, that's what Ireland should do. Of course, that's what Canada should do. Of course, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do in every way, including morally, right? And of course, that's what's starting to happen with French cuisine only, because we don't have the option of recruiting French people to work for minimum wage in the back of the kitchen anymore. They won't do it. It's just hard to do. It's hard to get the French to leave behind the level of pay, the level of benefits, the quality of life they have in France to take up the sort of minimum wage back of the restaurant jobs that we presume we can get infinite numbers of people to do from the Philippines, from China, from India, right? Isn't it different to have people who are the leaders in your society representing those other cultures and teaching whatever is really valuable about those cultures to your own? That would be real multiculturalism. To say, hey, you know what? In Canada, we're not proud that we have immigrants working for minimum wage making Chinese food. What we're proud of is that we have a bunch of people who are experts in Chinese cuisine, and we pay them more than $100,000 a year to teach us how to cook Chinese food. And now we can do it also. Now we have actually gained something from their culture. Now, Chinese language is obvious. Nobody can even debate whether or not it's worthwhile to import people who are experts to teach Chinese language. We've got to do it. We're way behind. It's an emergency, right? Okay, what else? What else is culture? It gets debatable quick. Chinese opera. Does it matter or not? If you think Chinese opera matters, it's the same thing. We've got to import some people who are the best of the best to teach us how to sing Chinese opera, to teach us how to perform Chinese opera. And then Chinese opera will become part of Canadian culture. It will become part of Irish culture. It will be something we appropriate and that we do for them ourselves in the same way that American rock and roll music has been appropriated by the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans. They do it themselves. They don't just import people at minimum wage to play American music for them. They've mastered the art, they've made it their own, and they've, of course, produced new genres of music that partly reflect the American tradition that rock and roll music is based on, or blues music, or rap music, by the way. Black American rap music has been appropriated by the Japanese, the Chinese, even the Cambodians, everyone. They've got their own rap music now. And it partly reflects something unique, something original you've made in the process of cultural production. This could happen with Chinese cuisine. This could happen with Chinese opera. This could happen with Chinese language. We can start producing our own literature and our own politics that reflects what we've taken from those traditions. We can start producing new philosophies that reflect the mastery of the old, ultimately the critique of the old, ultimately the demolition of the old. Okay. That, in brief, is my vision of the future. It can only be achieved by the negation of everything we have come to presuppose as sacred, but in fact is bad and evil and wrong. What we call culture is tyranny. The model of a 21st century society built on multiculturalism is counterproductive. And in the lives of individual people, as well as when scaled up to look at us in our masses in the millions, the outcomes are, in a word, tragic.